A simple, kind gesture from a young waitress sets off a chain of events that catches the attention of a billionaire father and changes all their lives forever. Understood? I'll now expand part 1 into about 1,300 words. Written in simple, natural, and interesting English. No headings, no extra notes, just the story itself in third-person style. The evening was quiet, and the city was starting to glow with lights when a sleek black car pulled up outside a small family restaurant. Inside the car sat a man who almost everyone in the business world knew by name. He was a billionaire, the kind of person who could buy anything he wanted and who was used to being respected, feared, or envied wherever he went. Yet tonight, he wasn't here for business. He was here because of his daughter. The little girl, no more than 7 years old, sat in the back seat, swinging her legs excitedly. She had begged her father to take her out to eat, not to one of the luxury hotels they usually went to, but to a cozy little place she had spotted near her school. At first, he resisted. He was used to 5-star service, private dining rooms, and a world where everything was polished to perfection. But his daughter had insisted, and there was something about her wide-eyed determination that made him agree so. He stepped out of the car, his expensive shoes clicking softly on the pavement, and offered his hand to his daughter. She grabbed it happily, pulling him toward the door of the restaurant. People inside glanced up as soon as the door opened. Some recognized him instantly. Others only sensed the air of authority and wealth around him. A few whispered among themselves, surprised that such a man would set foot in a modest, family-run diner. The waitress on duty that evening noticed too. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, and though her uniform was neat, it was clear she had been working hard. Stray strands of hair had slipped from her bun, and there was a faint tiredness in her eyes, but she wore a warm smile as she picked up menus and approached the new guests. She had no idea at that moment that her life was about to take a turn she never imagined. The billionaire sat down at a booth with his daughter across from him. He pulled out his phone almost immediately, scrolling through emails and business updates. The world he lived in never seemed to rest, and even when he was with his daughter, he struggled to put it aside. The girl, however, didn't mind. She was used to her father being busy. She busied herself with the menu, her small fingers tracing the colorful pictures of pancakes, burgers, and ice cream sundaes. When the waitress came over, the girl looked up and smiled brightly. "Can I have pancakes with chocolate chips?" she asked. The waitress laughed gently, nodding, and turned to take the father's order. He barely glanced at the menu, asking for a simple steak, his tone polite but clipped. The waitress noticed his sharp suit, the watch on his wrist that probably cost more than she made in a year, and the way he carried himself. Something about him told her he wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful. Still, she kept her voice steady, thanked them, and walked off toward the kitchen. As they waited, the daughter chatted happily about school, her friends, and the art project she had been working on. Her father nodded every so often, but his attention kept drifting back to his phone. He didn't notice when a strand of his daughter's long hair fell forward, dipping into the syrup from the pancakes when they arrived. The little girl frowned, trying to push it back herself, but her small fingers were sticky from the syrup, and her hair only got messier. The waitress noticed right away. She had just set down a tray at the next table when she saw the girl struggling. Without a second thought, she walked back over. "Sweetheart, let me help you with that," she said softly. She bent down, her movements gentle, and with her clean hand, she tucked the girl's hair neatly behind her ears. For a moment, she smoothed it down, making sure it wouldn't fall forward again. The little girl giggled, relieved, but the billionaire had lifted his eyes from his phone at that exact moment. He watched the waitress's fingers brush against his daughter's hair. His gaze sharpened. The waitress suddenly froze in place, realizing what she had done. In her world, it was a natural gesture, something any caring adult might do for a child. But this was no ordinary customer. This was a man who looked like he could buy the restaurant 10 times over without thinking twice. Her hand hovered awkwardly in the air before she quickly pulled it back. Her smile faltered as her face turned pale. She stammered, I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean." The restaurant grew unusually quiet. Other diners had noticed, and a couple of her co-workers exchanged worried glances. They all knew that rich customers could be unpredictable, and this one wasn't just rich, he was untouchable. One complaint from him could cost her not just her shift, but her job entirely. The daughter, however, was oblivious to the tension. She grinned at the waitress and said, "Thank you. Now I can eat without getting sticky hair." Her laughter rang out, innocent and cheerful, but it only made the waitress more nervous. She looked at the father, her heart thudding. The billionaire didn't speak right away. His eyes, usually cold and unreadable in business meetings, stayed fixed on the waitress. She shifted uncomfortably, clutching her notepad, waiting for him to react. Every second felt stretched, as though time itself had slowed down. In those moments, she regretted everything. Why hadn't she just handed the girl a napkin instead? Why hadn't she asked the father if he wanted help? Why had she been so careless as to touch the child of someone like him? She imagined him calling the manager, demanding she be fired. Maybe even saying she had no right to touch his daughter. But instead of anger, his expression was unreadable. He wasn't frowning, but he wasn't smiling either. He simply studied her, his eyes searching her face, as though trying to figure something out. It unsettled her even more. Finally, after what felt like forever, he lowered his gaze back to his phone. He didn't say a word. He didn't scold her, didn't dismiss her, didn't even acknowledge the apology. He simply let the moment pass as if nothing had happened. The waitress stepped back quickly, muttering another quiet sorry before walking away. Her cheeks burned as she busied herself with another table, though her hands shook slightly. She told herself to stay professional, to keep working as though everything was normal. But inside, she couldn't stop replaying the moment over and over again. Meanwhile, the daughter happily dug into her pancakes, chatting away about her favorite cartoons. The billionaire, however, was no longer looking at his phone. He was watching the waitress from a distance, his mind turning over the small gesture he had just witnessed. In his world, people rarely acted without calculation. Every smile, every word, every handshake usually had an agenda behind it. But what she had done hadn't been calculated. It was instinctive, natural, and strangely genuine. For the first time in a long while, he felt curious about a stranger. The waitress walked away, her face still warm with embarrassment, trying her best to steady her breathing. She had been working here for months, and she had never felt so nervous in front of a customer before. She could feel the eyes of her coworkers on her, whispering in hushed voices about what she had done. Some of them shook their heads, as if silently warning her that she had crossed a dangerous line. Everyone knew that people with money, especially people like him, didn't like others touching their children. She feared she had made a mistake she could never take back. At the booth, the billionaire sat completely still for a few moments. He wasn't a man who showed his emotions easily. His whole life had been about control, about keeping his thoughts hidden behind an unreadable face. In the boardroom, people often struggled to guess whether he was angry, pleased, or disappointed. Now, he was using that same mask as he watched the waitress return to her duties. But inside, he wasn't angry. He was curious. Something about the way she had acted stayed with him. She hadn't hesitated, hadn't asked for permission, hadn't even stopped to think about who he was. She had simply helped his daughter as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That was unusual. In his world, everyone thought before acting around him. Everyone measured their words and moves carefully, like chess players afraid of making a wrong step. This woman hadn't done that. She had reacted like a normal human being. The little girl noticed none of this. She was too busy eating her pancakes and talking happily about school. "Daddy, guess what? My teacher said my drawing was the best in class," she announced with her mouth full of chocolate chips. He gave a small nod and a faint smile. But his thoughts were still on the waitress. The waitress, meanwhile, felt her stomach twist every time she passed their table. She kept expecting the billionaire to raise his hand, call the manager over, and complain. She imagined being told to take off her apron and leave on the spot. She couldn't afford to lose this job. Her rent, her bills, even her younger brother's school expenses depended on the money she earned here. One mistake could cost her everything. She hated herself for being careless. She decided to stay out of sight as much as possible. letting another server take care of nearby tables. But she couldn't avoid the booth completely. She had to check if everything was fine. When she finally walked over again, she kept her eyes low, her voice soft. "Is everything okay with your food?" she asked carefully, as if each word might upset him. The billionaire didn't answer immediately. He set down his phone and looked at her. His gaze was steady, sharp, the kind of look that could make even powerful businessmen sweat. The waitress froze again, clutching her notepad. Her heart raced. She braced herself for criticism. But then he spoke, his voice calm. "The food is fine, that was all. Nothing more. No anger, no complaint, no dismissal. Just 4 words." Yet those 4 words made her release a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She nodded quickly, muttered, "Thank you, sir," and turned to leave, her knees almost trembling. The other staff watched closely. They were surprised too. Many had thought he would lash out, that he would demand she be fired. Instead, he seemed unusually quiet. They exchanged puzzled looks, whispering among themselves. One of them leaned in and said, "You're lucky." Anyone else would have been gone already, but the billionaire wasn't thinking about firing her. He was watching her carefully. Every time she passed through the dining room, he noticed how she moved, how she spoke to customers, how she smiled at children, how she balanced trays without complaint. She was clearly tired, but she didn't let it show. When a customer spilled a drink, she rushed to clean it up without frustration. When an older man struggled to stand, she held out her arm to steady him. Everything she did seemed natural, not forced. The daughter noticed too. She leaned across the table and whispered loudly, "Daddy, I like her. She's nice." Her father glanced at her, then back at the waitress. "You do?" "Yes," the girl nodded. "She fixed my hair so I could eat. No one else ever does that." She giggled, swinging her legs under the table. That simple statement stuck with him. His daughter rarely connected with strangers, yet she liked this waitress after only a few minutes. It was unusual, and he couldn't ignore it. The waitress, though, still thought she was on the edge of disaster. When she returned with a pitcher of water, her hands shook slightly as she refilled their glasses. She said a polite "excuse me" and kept her eyes on the table, never daring to meet his gaze. Her mind kept racing with questions. Why hadn't he reacted? Was he just waiting for the right moment to humiliate her? Would he complain after he left? The not knowing made her even more anxious. The daughter, oblivious to her fear, smiled at her again. "Thank you," she said sweetly, holding out her empty glass. The waitress smiled back without thinking, her natural kindness breaking through her nerves. For a brief moment their eyes met, and the billionaire noticed the way she softened when looking at his child. He tapped his finger against the table slowly, a habit he had when he was thinking. To his daughter, it was nothing. To him, it meant his mind was working, analyzing, calculating. This wasn't a business deal, but it felt almost the same. He was trying to understand someone he couldn't read easily, and that intrigued him. The rest of the meal passed in quiet tension. The waitress moved around carefully, doing her best to avoid further mistakes. The staff kept stealing glances, expecting a storm that never came. The billionaire remained calm, almost too calm, and his silence carried more weight than anger ever could. When they finished eating, the daughter leaned back happily, chocolate smudged around her mouth. The waitress brought napkins, and the girl wiped her face while humming. The billionaire finally put away his phone completely and folded his hands on the table. He had decided something, though he didn't show it. The waitress, still convinced she was in trouble, hesitated before asking softly, "Would you like me to bring the check now, sir?" He looked at her for a long moment. She felt exposed under his gaze, as though he could see right through her. Then he nodded. "Yes, bring the check." She rushed off, relieved, but her relief didn't last long. As she printed the bill, her coworkers surrounded her, whispering nervously. "He's been watching you all night," one said. "Do you think he's going to complain after he leaves?" Another added, "Just be ready. If he says something to the manager, you might lose this job." Their words only made her more anxious. Still, she carried the check back to the table with steady hands. She placed it down gently and said, "Here you go, sir." He didn't take it immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his seat and studied her again. His daughter was busy licking chocolate from her fingers, completely unaware of the strange atmosphere. The waitress felt her chest tighten, waiting for the verdict. But again, he said nothing. He simply reached into his wallet, slid a card into the billfold, and handed it back without a word. The waitress walked away, confused. Why hadn't he spoken? Why hadn't he said anything at all? It was as if he had chosen silence on purpose, leaving her with more questions than answers. For the rest of the shift, she couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on her. And at the booth, the billionaire couldn't shake the memory of her gentle touch on his daughter's hair. A gesture so small, yet so powerful. He wasn't angry. He was intrigued. And that curiosity was something he hadn't felt in a very long time. The restaurant grew busier as the evening went on. More families came in, laughter and the clinking of plates filling the air. But at one booth, the billionaire remained quiet, his sharp eyes occasionally lifting from his food to follow the movements of the young waitress. She tried not to notice, but every time she glanced his way, she caught him studying her. It made her uneasy, though he never said a word. She continued her work as best as she could. She carried heavy trays, wiped down tables, and smiled at children who giggled as they spilled fries onto the floor. She moved quickly, gracefully, though the long shift was beginning to wear her down. She felt a dull ache in her back, and her hands were dry from constantly washing them, but she kept her smile. Customers didn't know how hard she worked behind that smile, and most never cared. But tonight, someone was watching closely. Even if she didn't know why, the billionaire tapped his fingers lightly on the table again. His daughter noticed this time. "Daddy, why do you keep looking at her?" she asked innocently, tilting her head. He gave a faint smile, but his eyes didn't soften. "Just curious," he said simply. The girl shrugged, not really understanding, and went back to sipping her drink through a straw. She liked the waitress and wanted to talk to her again. The chance came sooner than she expected. When the waitress walked by to refill water at the next table, the little girl called out, "Excuse me, can you come here?" Her voice was cheerful, innocent, and impossible to ignore. The waitress froze for a second before turning with a polite smile. "Yes, sweetheart." The girl beamed. "I want to tell you about my drawing at school." Before her father could stop her, she launched into a story about how her teacher had praised her art project, describing the colors she used and how her classmates liked it. The waitress bent slightly to listen, nodding with real interest. She didn't pretend, she didn't rush. She actually listened, as though the little girl's story was the most important thing in the world. The billionaire sat back, silently watching. He saw how the waitress's face lit up when she smiled at his daughter, how her eyes softened, and how she never once glanced at her watch or hurried away. It was such a small thing, but it meant something to him. His daughter was often ignored even by adults who were supposed to care. Teachers and nannies did their jobs, but rarely with warmth. Here was a stranger, giving his child genuine attention without expecting anything in return. After the girl finished her story, the waitress said warmly, "That's wonderful. I bet your drawing was beautiful. You should be proud of yourself." The little girl grinned, her cheeks glowing with happiness. "Thank you. You're really nice." The waitress straightened, her cheeks flushing slightly at the unexpected compliment. She gave a polite nod and said, "You're very sweet. Keep drawing, okay?" before moving on. But the billionaire wasn't done with her. He decided he wanted to hear her voice too, not just in small exchanges with his daughter. So the next time she passed by, he raised his hand. She approached cautiously, her notepad tucked to her side. "Yes, sir? Is there something else I can get you?" Shook his head slowly. "I just had a question. How long have you been working here?" The waitress blinked, surprised. Customers rarely asked personal questions, especially not men like him. Still, she answered honestly. "Almost a year, sir," he nodded thoughtfully. "And you work full-time?" Her fingers tightened on her notepad, unsure if she should answer. But his tone wasn't sharp, just curious. "Yes, sir. Sometimes extra shifts, too." His eyes narrowed slightly, but not with anger. "Why so many?" The waitress hesitated, biting her lip. She usually kept her personal life private, but something about his steady gaze made her feel she couldn't lie. "I'm paying for school," she admitted quietly. "And I help with my younger brother's expenses. He's still in high school." There was no pride in her voice, just plain honesty. She didn't say it to gain sympathy, only because he had asked. The billionaire leaned back, studying her again. She looked nervous, as though she feared she had said too much, but he saw no greed in her eyes, no hidden motive, just exhaustion mixed with determination. His daughter leaned forward excitedly. "You go to school too? What do you study?" The waitress smiled softly at her. "Business management. It's tough, but I want to finish. Maybe one day I can start something of my own." The little girl's eyes lit up. "That's cool. Daddy does business too. He's really good at it." The waitress's eyes flickered briefly toward him, then quickly away. "I'm sure he is," she said politely, not daring to say more. She excused herself soon after, leaving the booth again. The billionaire's gaze followed her as she walked away. Something inside him shifted. He was used to people trying to impress him with polished words, resumes, or connections. This young woman had none of that. She wasn't trying to impress him at all. She was simply working hard, supporting her family, and chasing her dream. He couldn't remember the last time he had met someone so unpretentious. The daughter tugged on his sleeve. "I like her even more now," she whispered. "She's nice and smart. Can we talk to her again before we go?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he thought about how rare it was for his daughter to connect with someone. He knew she was often lonely. Surrounded by bodyguards, nannies, and teachers, she rarely made genuine connections outside of school. And here, in a small restaurant, she had found someone she liked after only a few minutes. The billionaire decided he wanted to test the waitress further. He wanted to see if her kindness was truly genuine or just a mask. So when she returned with the check later, he slid a few crisp bills inside. More than the cost of the meal. The waitress's eyes widened slightly when she saw the large tip. For a moment, she looked unsure. Many people would have grabbed the money with excitement, maybe even bragged about their luck. But she hesitated. She pressed her lips together, then looked at him with careful eyes. "Thank you, sir. This will really help," she said sincerely. Not gushing, not greedy, just grateful. She tucked the money away quickly as though she didn't want to draw attention to it. Then she added softly, "It'll go toward my brother's school fees. He wants to be an engineer one day." The billionaire's brow lifted. She hadn't said she would spend it on herself, or something frivolous. Her first thought was her family. It stirred something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. A reminder of the values he had once held before his life became dominated by wealth and power. He nodded slowly, his face still unreadable, but his mind was full of thoughts. She had passed his test. She wasn't pretending. She was exactly who she seemed to be. The little girl smiled up at the waitress one more time. "You're my favorite," she declared proudly, her voice carrying across the room. Several customers turned to look, some smiling at the sweet moment. The waitress blushed, laughing softly. "That's very kind of you, sweetheart. Thank you." When she walked away, the billionaire sat in silence for a while, thinking. For years he had lived in a world where everyone wanted something from him. But this woman had asked for nothing. She had only shown kindness to his daughter and honesty in her words. Found himself unexpectedly moved, though he would never admit it out loud. He had come here for a simple meal. Instead, he had found something that unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. And as he prepared to leave, he knew one thing for certain. This was not the last time he would think about the waitress who tucked his daughter's hair behind her ear. The meal was nearly finished, and the little girl was happily swinging her legs under the booth, hemming to herself as she licked the last bit of chocolate from her spoon. The billionaire father leaned back in his seat, still silent, his sharp eyes following the waitress as she moved about the restaurant. His daughter had clearly taken a liking to her, and that alone made her different from the countless people who passed through their lives. But he wanted to see more. He wanted to understand if what he had seen in her was real or just a moment of luck. When the waitress came by again, he spoke in a voice that was calm but commanding. "We'll take the check." She nodded quickly, took the empty plates, and went to print the bill. Her heart was still uneasy from the earlier moment when she had touched his daughter's hair. Even though he hadn't said anything harsh, she still feared what might happen. She couldn't afford to be careless now. She returned with the bill and placed it gently on the table. "Whenever you're ready, sir," she said politely. The billionaire opened the black leather folder and slipped a credit card inside. Then, almost as an afterthought, He pulled out a thick stack of bills from his wallet and placed it on top of the check. It was far more than the meal cost, several times more. He closed the folder and slid it toward her without a word. The waitress froze when she saw the money. For a second she thought it had to be a mistake. No one tipped that much in this restaurant. Most customers left small change, and a good night meant a handful of singles. This was different. This was enough to cover her rent for the month, maybe even more. Her coworkers noticed too. From across the room, they whispered and exchanged wide-eyed looks. Some even smiled enviously. They had seen wealthy customers before, but this was rare. Everyone knew the billionaire could afford it, but the question was why? Why her? The waitress's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the folder. She felt all eyes on her. She wanted to smile, but she didn't want to look greedy. She wanted to thank him, but she didn't want to sound desperate. She swallowed hard and said softly, "Thank you, sir. This means a lot." The billionaire didn't reply right away. He simply studied her with that same piercing gaze. It was as if he was waiting to see how she would react next. The waitress hesitated, then added honestly, "This will help me with my brother's school fees. He's in his last year of high school, and he's been working so hard. He wants to be an engineer one day." Her voice shook slightly, not because she wanted pity, but because she rarely spoke about her struggles to strangers. She didn't like showing her vulnerability. Yet somehow, standing there under his gaze, she felt the words spill out naturally. The billionaire leaned back, silent as ever, but inside something stirred. Most people, when given a large tip, thought only of themselves. They bragged, they celebrated, they took it as luck. But this woman had immediately thought of her brother. She hadn't spoken about herself at all. That told him more than any resume or interview could have. The little girl clapped her hands happily. "See, Daddy? She's nice. She helps her brother, and she helped me too." Her voice was loud, drawing chuckles from nearby tables. The waitress blushed, trying not to laugh. "Thank you, sweetheart. You're very kind." She gently touched the girl's shoulder before stepping back as she walked away. The billionaire felt something he hadn't in years, a kind of humility. He remembered his own youth, long before he had built his empire. He had once been the boy who studied late into the night, who dreamed big while his family sacrificed everything to help him. Somewhere along the way, he had lost touch with those roots. Wealth had swallowed him, and the people around him cared more about what he had than who he was. Watching this young woman, he realized he was seeing a reflection of values he once admired: sacrifice, hard work, and honesty. The little girl leaned across the table again, her eyes sparkling. "Daddy, I want to see her again. Can we come back?" He looked at his daughter carefully. She rarely asked for such things. Usually, she grew bored quickly, but tonight was different. She wasn't just enjoying pancakes. She was enjoying the company of someone who had treated her like a regular child, not the daughter of a billionaire. He gave her a small nod. "We'll see." Meanwhile, the waitress stood behind the counter, her hands still trembling as she slipped the money into her apron. She wasn't thinking about herself, not about the shoes she needed or the bills piling up. She was thinking of her brother's face when she told him she could cover more of his tuition. For once, things felt a little lighter, even if she didn't fully understand why the man had given so much, but she still couldn't shake her unease. Was it truly a kind gesture, or was there some hidden meaning behind it? Rich people didn't do things without reason. She had seen enough to know that money often came with strings attached. She told herself not to get her hopes up, not to think this meant anything more than a rare moment of generosity. The billionaire, however, was thinking differently. He was still testing her. He wanted to see if the money would change her. Would she start hovering around him, trying to please him more? Would she boast about the tip? Would she suddenly treat him differently now that she knew he was generous? But she didn't. She stayed the same. She kept working, kept moving from table to table, kept smiling at children and carrying trays. She didn't glance at him with expectation. She didn't linger at his booth fishing for more. She simply carried on with her shift as though nothing had happened. That told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't motivated by greed. She hadn't changed because of the money. She had stayed true to herself. That impressed him more than he cared to admit. His daughter finished her drink and leaned against him, tired but happy. She whispered, "She's my friend now." The billionaire almost smiled. His daughter had so few friends, so few people she trusted, and now she had chosen this waitress, of all people. As they prepared to leave, he took one last look around the restaurant. He saw the tired faces of the staff, the families laughing over simple meals, and the waitress wiping down a table with the same quiet focus she had shown all night. She didn't even notice him watching. For years, he had surrounded himself with polished executives, wealthy investors, and people who bowed to his power. But here, in a small restaurant, he had found something rare: authenticity. And it had come from a young woman who probably didn't even realize how extraordinary she was. When he stood, his daughter slipped her small hand into his. She looked up at him, hopeful. "Can we come back soon?" He looked down at her, then at the waitress again. "Maybe sooner than you think," he said softly, as they walked toward the door. The waitress glanced up and met his eyes one last time. He gave a small nod, almost like a silent acknowledgement. Before stepping out into the night, she stood there for a moment, confused but strangely moved. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew she would never forget this night. And neither would he. The restaurant had started to quiet down as the evening drew to a close. Families were leaving, laughter fading into the night, and the little girl was holding her father's hand tightly, reluctant to leave her newfound friend behind. The billionaire watched his daughter's cheerful chatter as she spoke about how nice the waitress had been, how she had helped her with her hair, and how she had listened to her stories. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace he rarely allowed himself to experience as they prepared to leave. The waitress carried a stack of menus toward the counter. She was exhausted from the long shift, but she had a quiet satisfaction that came from helping others. Little did she know, this night would change her life in ways she couldn't even imagine. The little girl tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy, can we ask her to come outside?" "I want to say goodbye properly." The billionaire glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He could see the hope in his daughter's eyes and the connection she had already formed with the young waitress. He gave a slow nod. "All right, let's go." The waitress froze when she saw them approaching. She wasn't expecting this. She had assumed their departure would be silent, that this encounter would end like so many others, brief, ordinary, and forgotten. But the little girl's smile and the hand of her father reaching toward her made her heart race. "Hi," the girl called out brightly. "I want to give you a hug before we go." The waitress's eyes widened. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was appropriate. But the genuine excitement in the child's face made her bend down and return the hug. It was warm and quick, but it carried more meaning than either of them realized. The billionaire stood nearby, watching quietly. He could see the relief in her eyes, the blush creeping across her cheeks, and the slight stiffening of her posture as she realized who he was. But instead of feeling anger or resentment, he felt something different. He felt respect. For the first time in years, someone had acted around him and his family without fear or pretense, and that authenticity struck a chord deep within him. As they stepped outside, the daughter waved energetically. "See you soon. Can you come visit again?" The waitress smiled softly, a little overwhelmed. "I'll try, sweetheart. I'll try." The billionaire stepped forward, his voice calm and deliberate. "I'd like to speak with you for a moment." The waitress froze, expecting reprimand or a test of some kind. Her hands tightened at her sides, unsure if she should nod or back away. But his tone was not threatening. It was measured, thoughtful, and genuine. "I've been watching you tonight," he said slowly. "I've seen how you treat people, how you care about others, and how you act without expectation. That's rare. Very rare." Her mouth opened slightly, unsure how to respond. She had worked hard, yes, and she had always tried to be kind, but no one had ever said anything like this to her before. "Especially not someone of his stature," he continued. "Most people I meet see my wealth, my status, or my power. They try to impress me, to take advantage of me, or to get something from me. You didn't. You acted naturally, honestly, and kindly. That tells me more about a person than anything else ever could." She swallowed hard, a mix of relief and disbelief flooding through her. She had expected judgment, but instead, she was being praised. She had always hoped that hard work and integrity mattered, but she hadn't realized that someone like him would notice. "I want to offer you an opportunity," he said, his eyes steady on hers. "I think you have potential, and I want to help you achieve more than you could on your own. If you're willing, I'd like to discuss this further sometime." The waitress's mind raced. She had heard about wealthy people offering help before, but it usually came with strings attached, conditions, obligations, or something to leverage. But there was no hint of that in his eyes. She could see sincerity. She could see that this was genuine. I don't know what to say," she managed softly. "Then say yes," he said quietly. "Just give me a chance to explain. That's all I ask." The little girl looked up at him with wide eyes. "See, I told you she's special, Daddy." He smiled faintly at his daughter before turning back to the waitress. "Give it some thought, no rush. But know that I want to help you, and I see who you really are." The waitress nodded, still trying to process everything. She felt a mixture of awe, nervousness, and excitement. The night had started as any other shift, with long hours and tired feet. But now it was turning into something extraordinary. She had touched a little girl's hair without thinking, and that small act had created a ripple that had reached someone she'd never imagined. As they walked to their car, the billionaire glanced at his daughter, who was smiling and chatting about how much she liked the waitress. He felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years, a reminder that genuine kindness, even in small gestures, mattered more than power or money. The waitress watched them leave, a strange sense of hope building in her chest. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt that maybe things could change. Maybe her hard work, her honesty, her kindness would finally be noticed and rewarded in a way she hadn't expected. As the black car pulled away into the night, the billionaire reflected on what had happened. He realized that in all his years of business and power, the most valuable thing he had witnessed tonight wasn't a deal, a profit, or an achievement. It was a moment of genuine human connection. A young woman, working hard and living honestly, had touched his daughter's life in a small but meaningful way. And in doing so, she had reminded him of something he had forgotten: the power of kindness, and the importance of recognizing it when it appeared. He knew that this wasn't just a fleeting encounter. He could feel that this was the start of something bigger, an opportunity, not only to help someone deserving, but also to reconnect with a part of himself he had lost over the years. Someone who acted from the heart, without fear, without expectation. It opened a door that no amount of money or power could ever buy. Back inside, the waitress finally took a moment to breathe. She leaned against the counter, hands still shaking slightly, and whispered to herself, "I can't believe that just happened." She didn't understand why the billionaire had chosen to speak to her, why he had offered her an opportunity, or how this would affect her life. All she knew was that for the first time in a long time, she felt seen, truly seen, and as she looked around at the quiet restaurant, the empty tables, and the fading lights, she realized that sometimes small gestures mattered more than anything else. A simple act of kindness, a touch, a smile, a moment of attention, could change lives in ways no one ever expected. Tonight it had changed hers, and in some quiet, unseen way. It had changed the life of a billionaire father and his daughter, too. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never forget this night. The little girl who smiled at her, and the man who saw something in her that no one else had. And somewhere deep inside, she felt a spark of hope, hope that life could be different, better, and filled with moments that mattered. The billionaire drove home silently, his daughter asleep against his side. He thought about the young waitress, her honesty, her dedication, and her courage. She hadn't sought anything from him, and yet she had given him something priceless, a reminder that goodness still existed in the world. And he promised himself that he would do what he could to honor that goodness, to give her a chance to rise, and to ensure that the small act she had done tonight wouldn't be forgotten. As the city lights blurred past, he allowed himself a rare smile. This night had begun as an ordinary evening at a restaurant, but it had ended as a moment that would linger in his mind for years. It had ended with a promise of change, of hope, and of possibilities that neither he nor the young waitress had anticipated.